Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it.
He was told to keep shocking the man, even when he thought he was killing him. And he did. What would make someone obey that kind of order? Was it fear, conditioning, or something darker hiding in all of us? In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram created one of the most controversial experiments in human history. Its goal was simple: find out how far an ordinary person would go, just because someone in authority told them to. It began in a quiet laboratory, tucked behind the walls of a respected university. Two strangers walked in, unaware their lives were about to be changed. Not by force, not by violence, but by instruction. A man in a white lab coat greeted them. Calm, confident, professional. One of them was told to sit behind a panel of switches, each switch labeled with increasing voltages, from 15 to 450 volts. The other person, taken into a separate room. Out of sight, the man in the lab coat turned and gave the first command. Administer the shock. There was a pause, a nervous chuckle, then a click. The sound of electricity. A scream. Real. Terrified. The man hesitated. He turned to the authority figure in the lab coat. He's in pain, he said, but the response was chillingly simple. The experiment requires that you continue. And so, he did, over and over again. What followed was one of the most disturbing experiments in psychological history, revealing how ordinary people can commit horrifying acts simply because they were told to. To understand the experiment, you have to understand the man who created it. Stanley Milgram wasn't just another academic chasing tenure. He was a psychological detective, driven by a question that haunted an entire generation. How could ordinary people, under orders, become monsters? He was born in 1933 in the Bronx, New York, the son of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. His childhood was marked by whispers of war, of atrocities, of the Holocaust. By the time Milgram was 10 years old, he had already seen the aftermath of a world torn apart by blind obedience to power. At school, he was brilliant, a thinker and observer, but he was also deeply affected by what he saw in history books. Images of concentration camps, reports of Nazi war trials, and the one phrase that echoed again and again: I was just following orders. That excuse, repeated by soldiers, officers, even executioners, it disturbed Milgram deeply. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it sounded eerily human. He wondered, if he were in their position, would he have obeyed too? Would anyone? Or was evil something only certain people were capable of? That question led him to Harvard, where he studied under some of the most respected psychologists of the time. But Milgram wasn't content writing papers. He wanted answers. Real answers. In 1960, he joined the faculty at Yale, and that's when he started planning what would become one of the most infamous and controversial experiments in psychological history. A test not of intelligence, but of morality, not in criminals or soldiers, but in everyday people, bankers, teachers, salesmen, fathers. He didn't want actors. He didn't want manipulators. He wanted to know, would the average person be willing to harm someone else if an authority figure told them it was necessary? What Milgram was about to uncover would shake the foundations of psychology and ignite an ethical firestorm that still burns today. The invitation seemed innocent enough. A newspaper ad. Men wanted for a study on memory and learning. $4 for 1 hour of participation. No mention of morality. No talk of pain. Just a simple experiment at Yale University. Volunteers showed up. Ordinary men from all walks of life. Teachers, barbers, engineers, clerks. Most of them had never set foot inside a laboratory before. They were greeted politely and told the experiment was about improving memory through punishment. In the room were 3 people. The experimenter, dressed in a gray lab coat, calm and authoritative. The volunteer, who believed he was there to help with a learning task. and a second man, supposedly another volunteer, who would play the role of the learner. What the real volunteer didn't know was that the learner was actually an actor, and the entire setup was a carefully crafted illusion. The draw to decide who would be the teacher and who would be the learner, rigged. Every time, the real participant became the teacher. The learner was then strapped into a chair in another room, his arms secured, electrodes attached to his skin. The teacher was brought into a separate space, placed in front of a shock generator. It looked intimidating. 30 switches, lined up from left to right, each one labeled with increasing voltage. 15 volts, 30, 45, and so on, all the way up to 450. Each switch also had a description: mild shock, moderate shock, danger, severe shock. The final switches were marked ominously: XXX.
Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock.
The instructions were simple. Read a series of word pairs to the learner. If the learner answered incorrectly, administer a shock, increasing the voltage each time. The learner, of course, was never actually shocked, but the teacher didn't know that. And from the other room came the sounds of agony. At first, mild grunts, then protests, screams, cries of pain, bangs on the wall.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me
You're
out.
responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Bird,
Let me
car,
out.
train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
Let me out. I told you I have a heart condition. The teacher would look to the experimenter, visibly shaken. Should I keep going? The experimenter, always calm, always firm, replied with one of 4 scripted prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must continue. No threats, no punishment, just words. And those words were enough to push people far beyond what they ever believed they were capable of. Some laughed nervously. Some trembled. One man had a full-blown seizure. But the terrifying truth? The majority obeyed. All the way to the maximum voltage. They believed they were electrocuting another human being to death. And they kept going simply because someone in a lab coat told them to. The results shocked everyone, including Milgram himself. Before the experiment began, he asked psychologists to predict how far people would go. The consensus? Maybe 1 in 100 would reach the maximum shock level. Only true sadists, they assumed, could ignore a person's screams. But the truth was far darker. In the first version of the experiment, 65% of participants went all the way, delivering what they believed to be 450 volts, labeled as danger, severe shock. That wasn't 1 in 100. That was 2 out of every 3 men. And this wasn't a fluke. Milgram ran the test over and over again, with dozens of volunteers, tweaking small details. He changed the location, from Yale's prestigious lab to a rundown office building. He changed who gave the commands, from a scientist in a lab coat to an ordinary person. Sometimes the learner was in the same room, sometimes just a voice behind a wall. And still, obedience remained frighteningly high, even when the learner pounded the wall. even when he begged to stop, even when he went completely silent, leaving the teacher to wonder if he had just died. Participants sweated. They shook. Some wept. But they obeyed. Why? That was Milgram's ultimate question. He concluded that the answer lies in authority, the invisible force that governs so much of human behavior. When someone perceives another person as legitimate authority, especially someone from an institution like science, government, or religion, their sense of personal responsibility can evaporate. They become an instrument, a tool. Their moral compass isn't gone, but it's overridden. And the scariest part? Most people don't realize it's happening. In interviews after the experiment, many participants claimed they felt uncomfortable. But when asked why they kept going, the answers were eerily similar. Because he told me to. I thought I had no choice. It wasn't my responsibility. Sound familiar? Those were the exact same justifications used by Nazi officers during the Nuremberg trials. Milgram's experiment didn't expose evil. It exposed something far more terrifying: compliance. Normal people willing to do horrific things simply because an authority figure told them to. The footage was grainy, black and white. A man in a lab coat calmly giving orders. Another man, trembling, his hand hovering over a switch labeled 450 volts. In the next room, a voice begging, screaming, finally, silence. When the public first saw the recordings from Milgram's experiment, they were stunned. Not because it had happened in some dark, dictatorial regime, but because it had happened right here, in America, in a prestigious Ivy League university, with volunteers who could be your neighbor, your coworker, or you. The media erupted. Headlines asked, could you be pushed to torture? What would you do? The public was divided. Some saw the study as a revelation, a mirror held up to society, exposing the hidden machinery of obedience. Others saw it as a moral horror show, a scientific betrayal. The participants had walked into a lab trusting they were helping research, not starring in a psychological nightmare. They weren't debriefed properly until after the shocks, if at all. Some suffered panic attacks. Others lived for years thinking they had harmed someone for real. One man wrote to Milgram decades later saying, I still can't sleep some nights. I hear that man's screams in my head. The scientific community responded with outrage. Ethics boards questioned whether psychology had gone too far. Had Milgram sacrificed humanity for the sake of knowledge? Was exposing the darkest side of obedience worth the trauma it caused? The experiment became the spark that ignited new rules. Institutional review boards, IRBs, were created to protect participants in psychological studies. Informed consent became non-negotiable. Debriefings became mandatory, and studies like Milgram's would never be allowed again. But that didn't stop the conversation. Far from it. The implications of Milgram's work began to ripple outward, across cultures, across disciplines. Educators used it to teach ethics. The military used it to examine the psychology of war crimes. Corporations used it to understand compliance in toxic workplaces. Even Hollywood took notice, using the experiment as inspiration for thrillers and dystopian stories. But one question haunted every room the conversation reached. If we are all capable of this, who can we really trust? Police officers following illegal orders, soldiers justifying atrocities, employees staying silent in the face of corruption. Again and again, Milgram's experiment echoed in real-world horrors. From Abu Ghraib to corporate fraud scandals to cult obedience. What the experiment showed was never limited to the lab. It was everywhere, hidden beneath the surface of modern society. The true power of Milgram's study wasn't in what it revealed about others. It was in the uncomfortable reflection it forced on ourselves. The truth that most people don't want to face. That under the right conditions, with the right pressure, even you could become the villain in someone else's story. And you might never even realize it. Picture this. You're sitting in a room. A scientist, calm and confident, tells you to continue. There's a man in the next room. Maybe you can't see him, but you can hear him, screaming, begging. And all you have to do is stop pressing the button. Just say no. Just stand up and walk away. But will you? Before watching this documentary, you probably thought the answer was obvious. Of course, you wouldn't hurt someone just because you were told to, right? That's what most people said before they sat in Milgram's chair. They were teachers, postmen, engineers, fathers. Not monsters, not psychopaths, just regular people. And they did it, not because they wanted to, not because they enjoyed it, but because they were told to. Obedience doesn't require hatred. It only requires hesitation. The brief moment where you surrender your judgment to someone else, where you trade your conscience for compliance. And that moment is far easier to reach than you think. The scariest part about Milgram's experiment wasn't the shock machine. It wasn't the screaming. It wasn't even the 450 volts. It was the silence. The moment when someone knew it was wrong, but did it anyway. The moment when a good person crossed the line, not out of rage, but routine. This isn't just a psychology experiment. It's a mirror, and it's asking you one final question. What would you have done? Because the real danger isn't just that most people obey. It's that most people never think they would. If this left you unsettled, if it made you question yourself, then this is just the beginning. Subscribe to Mind Uncovered, because we're not done exploring the human mind. Not even close.